Well, we're still not showing everything again. Why isn't this showing? No, that's not what I want either. Okay, still nobody there but Cheryl yet. But she's there, so we must have it on right. Okay. Here's a illustration. I chose this because this is one of the passages that's on that thing. This is a typical page in a Greek Bible, the academic scholarly version, so that you can see what the footnotes are like. How many variations are on this page, and you can see what they are. There's one in verse 15 and 16, one word in 17, a couple of words in 18, a couple of words in 20. In 24, for instance, you simply have a matter of whether this is spelled, how the name is spelled. Here it's simply an issue of what's the exact pronoun that was used. Here there's a slight difference in one phrase. This, of course, is all pretty much nonsense to you because it's in Greek. So over on this side of the page, I chose a bilingual edition where you have the English. So you have the English footnotes. And you can see that here in verse 16, you have a difference between ordered them not to make him known and charged that they should not make him known. And then in 17, you have a difference between this was to fulfill and that it might be fulfilled. Passive, active difference. In 18, my servant whom I have chosen, and the difference, my beloved in whom I have. And that's the kind of, when you're looking at the differences, you can count a whole bunch, but that's the typical situation. It doesn't significantly change the meaning of the verse, changes it from an active to a passive, changes it from a first person to a second or third person or something like that. Which, of course, would make some difference in the meaning when you're writing a commentary and you want to be exact. But for the average, ordinary reader, this isn't the kind of thing there's any point in even struggling with, because it's, well, how do you spell this guy's name? Does he have two E's or one E and an E that follows? Or is it an R or an N or a B or a V or something like that? Okay, we'll drop this one and we'll go to the one that I gave you. The New Testament. And let's get this all the way up. Okay. Any question about any of these that you got to look at? Anything you found interesting, troubling, fascinating of any of these in the New Testament? Okay, Marshall's made it in. And as I mentioned, you see, as you go through here, you have two stories of length. The only passages that have any differences to amount to anything. Only the end of Mark and the story of the woman brought to Jesus charged with adultery in John. There aren't any other long passages in the entire New Testament that have any indication that there's any problem. And the only one of those two that you would lose something if you took it completely out is the story of the woman. You took out the whole end of Mark, so you've got Matthew and John and Luke. So, and if you go back and you look at the longer endings of Mark, there's not hardly anything in them that's distinctive except the one thing that we like to make over in the modern era of Christianity. The signs that will follow those who preach the gospel. Take up snakes and drink poison. And obviously, there's always been a problem with that passage in terms of what people do with it, and in terms of the fact that to whatever degree that promise is authentic and real, the reality is a significant number of Christians, even in the New Testament time, and even in the New Testament, die as martyrs. So the very thing that Jesus says will happen doesn't happen. They die. They're not saved from death. And it starts very early in the book of Acts when one of the main guys he's talking to, James, gets killed. and you don't get but a couple of more chapters, and one of the very second group of leaders chosen in Jerusalem gets killed. And then the next story is the guy who was instrumental, or at least involved in the death of Stephen, starts killing some others. And they're not saved either. So the promise certainly did not have any absolute fulfillment, and not even widespread fulfillment. Because there are a couple of other times in the story where somebody died. Now, a couple of times they're revived, but not always. So trying to make a great deal over that only unique passage in the end of Mark clearly runs into its own problems too.
So out of the four Gospels, John was the only one that actually knew Jesus.
No, the tradition is Matthew was one of the 12 too.
Matthew?
Yeah, there's a Matthew among the 12. There's a Matthew, Levi, and there's often the attempt to put those names together, make it the same person, the tax collector.
Right.
That Jesus called. I hold the minority opinion that the reason we have different lists of the apostles is because there was a group of men more than 12. And when they talk about the 12, they're using the traditional Jewish chosen number, which was never true, because even the 12 in the Old Testament weren't 12. There was 13 of them. When after Jesus dies and Peter says we got to get somebody to take Judas' place, there's at least two more that they vote on. So there were at least 14 in the group. And my reading of the Acts passage is there were actually more. Those were simply the two they chose to vote on, to cast lots on. There were actually more than that who had been with Jesus from the beginning and were witnesses of his resurrection. And thus, in certain areas, these 12 names were remembered. In another area was a couple of different names.
Does not Paul claim to have met Jesus as well?
Pardon? No, Paul does not ever claim to have known Jesus except in the post-resurrection appearance that Jesus made to him and subsequent interchanges between the two. On the road to Damascus, he is confronted by Jesus, but even then one could argue he didn't see him because he was immediately blinded. Paul says he was, after he died in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, and last of all, he was seen by me as one born out of wrong time. And the other indications are that he insists that a great deal of his knowledge of the Christian faith was not derived from people. It came direct. Well, there's even some indication in his wording that there's a very mystical connection between he and Jesus. And the reality is, there have been mystics all the way through the Christian tradition who believe they met Jesus and talked with him on numerous occasions.
So in today's world, that each gospel wrote his own book, Matthew wrote Matthew.
No. because none of them are named.
Right.
So we don't have any, and there's not even any really strong evidence tradition in the first few hundred years of the church. We got a couple of mentions of each one, but there's not an absolute, this is who it was. And so in the modern world, there are any number of scholars who are still going to want to put the Gospels as significant editorial developments, and that none of those four books, as we have them today, is original. They've all been edited to some degree by the first generation or two of people who worked with them, and we're not talking about years apart. We're talking about people who worked within a matter of a very few years who produced this document.
So it just seems to be amazing God's work with the Holy Spirit's work that we continue to do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We were selected.
Yeah. And the reality is they're pretty rare. We now have a complete copy of the Gospel of Thomas, which is an alternative version. It has some additional stories, particularly his childhood, and some sayings that are not recorded in the Gospels. But we already knew that there's a lot of sayings of Jesus that aren't recorded there. So that there would have been another copy. Luke says when he writes his, that because many others have done this, with some apparent differences, I decided that I would check all this out and give you an orderly presentation of this tradition. Well, that doesn't hardly sound like three, and I'm writing the fourth one. I have no doubt that there were many.
Everything that Jesus spoke.
Yeah, that's in John. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and John, it makes it very obvious with John that I only picked a dozen, 15 stories. I didn't make any attempt to give you a comprehensive view of Jesus' ministry, let alone Jesus' life. I just put these together in order to convince you that he's who he said he was, so you could believe. And if you won't believe these, then if I doubled it, tripled it, quadrupled it, you still wouldn't believe it. If these stories won't convince you, then nothing will convince you.
So as I was researching, I came upon something called a Q source.
Yeah, the Q source, and there's an interesting story behind this. The Q source is the speculated document of the sayings, mainly of Jesus, that's in Luke, that's not in Mark. And so the theory is that Luke produced his version not by independently going around and checking all these people, but by taking Mark and this other book, Q. And what's fascinating about it is even though the Q wasn't invented till a couple of hundred years ago, there's even disagreement as to what the Q stood for. There's 2 or 3 different words, mostly I think they're all in German, that start with Q, that would fit a description of a book like this. And nobody knows for sure what the reason for the Q was. But that's what they did. And it was a convenient way to explain most of the material in Luke that's not in Mark.
And they say the same thing about Matthew.
And so Matthew, the same thing, has an additional source, and it's not like he's crafting together a whole complex of stories that are being told among the churches. And he makes his own independent choice of the ones he knows, somehow in relationship to Mark. It's entirely possible that Mark and a few of the stories in Luke and Matthew are all the stories that existed past the very first, well, that people told. That within a very few short years after Jesus died and the church started, the repertoire of the stories of Jesus was pretty limited to what we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that therefore, Matthew was stuck. Even if he didn't have Mark, he had only the stories that are in Mark, plus a few that he knew or people he talked with told him about. And there wasn't much other available. Now, that's a little bit difficult to handle if the writer was really the Apostle Matthew, who was there. Because if he was there, he's got 3.5 years of stories.
Right. But this is all between the 2nd century or 100?
No, this is before 100.
Before 100?
Yeah, you're talking about before 75 in most cases with the Gospels.
But the actual writing, the actual print into the Bible, into where they canonize.
No, that doesn't take place for several more hundred years.
Several more?
Yeah. Matthew, Mark, and Luke almost have to be written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem because of the way they handle the story. And it's in Matthew 24 where Jesus talks about this all going to get torn down. And it's a little difficult to imagine that Jesus talking about the destruction of the temple would not have said, and that's what happened, if it had happened. And so there's pretty solid consensus that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were composed before 70. And it's a little difficult to figure out how in the world they're so alike if, in fact, they weren't relying on some basic set of material that pre-existed the three of them, or at least pre-existed Mark. But you see, that whole theory is simply built on the fact that Mark is shorter than Matthew and Luke. And therefore, it makes more sense to believe Mark wrote his, and then Matthew and Luke added stuff to what they had in Mark. But you're clearly dealing with a verbal culture, an oral culture, not a written culture. And so there is just no doubt that the first 30, 40 years of the Christian faith was fundamentally based on verbal accounts. The apostles telling people who told people, other people who were there at various times, who heard the Sermon on the Mount and had a pretty vivid memory of some of the things Jesus said, could add to somebody. But it certainly looks like that very early there was a pretty limited repertoire of stories that are shared by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, how that came about, we don't have the foggiest idea. Quell is as good a, Q is as good a speculation as any. And very likely, given Luke's remark, there were various people, early Christians, maybe even some of the apostles, some of these guys who didn't get named in the list, put together their recollections, maybe even compared notes. Yeah, that 500 who saw him after his resurrection, you see. Early congregations of people in particularly Galilee, where he spent most of his time, sat around on Sunday mornings and told stories of the things they heard Jesus say, the things they saw Jesus do. They didn't, the apostles couldn't be in all those congregations. So there were a whole lot of Christian congregations, especially in Galilee. And the story in Acts, you see, doesn't tell us hardly anything about those people. It tells us only about Judea. Those people were sharing what knowledge they had. And somewhere along the line, it started getting written down. My introduction to the class on how we got the Bible is you answer that with one sentence, and that is nobody knows. The class can talk about how the Bible got to us, how it was transmitted in manuscript and then translated and that kind of, but there was the foggiest idea how we got it. We just had it. There wasn't a church council that sat down and said, okay, we got 37 books here or 147 books or whatever. We need to decide which ones that we're going to make a canon out of. They had a canon. They had books they referred to. And when they started trying to then wrestle with formalizing that in some way, well, there were a few off to the end or the side that sometimes got included in a list, sometimes didn't. Gospel of Thomas, an example. But some of the letters of John, for instance, the book of Hebrews, because nobody was sure about who wrote it. So there were some questions about that. And for people who were big on New Testament versus Old Testament, and there were some who really got down on the Old Testament God even, well, then the book of Hebrews was suspect because it takes so much of the Old Testament, so it can't be authentic. Those are all before the New Testament. The New Testament books are not disputed. That's what they used. That's what they had. And as I said in the beginning, they had no real strong tradition about where they got this stuff. It just developed. It, as far as I'm concerned, is clearly the hand of God. And the Old Testament, of course, is even more true that way. How in the world that material ever got collected, written, let alone, and then collected the way it did, is a mystery. It just did.
It takes me back to, I can't remember the name of the individual, but it's in the book of Acts when the disciples were being persecuted and they were told not to preach the gospel anymore to anyone. And there was this one of the guys, you might remember his name, and he says that, leave these people alone. There was other people before them.
Yeah.
That as much as he tried, he did not make it.
Yeah.
You will see that the same thing will happen to these individuals.
Yeah.
If God is not one of them.
If this isn't God, it'll be gone out of our hair. We won't have to worry about it. And if it is, we aren't going to be able to stop it. So, there's no use fighting it. And that's, I had a preacher acquaintance years and years ago in a pretty elaborate discussion that we had had, that he was in a different communion than me, and we were talking about our differences and the awkwardness of our even talking to each other, because our groups were so combative with each other. And at the local congregation, it was even worse. We were always fighting over this one little crazy thing or that little crazy thing. And he said, and that's the proof that it's of God, because no other institution would survive acting the way we do and doing the things we've done. It just wouldn't last if God weren't in it. So I think the same thing is true of the Bible. If there's no other particular question anybody wants to raise on one of these passages in the New Testament, let me take you over to the one in the Old Testament. Now let's see if we can find that one. Here it is. And you see much the same kind of thing, except here we do have, in a few cases, intriguing things, on this first page, let me point out some issues with these sources. The Samaritans you know about in the New Testament, but the reality is, historically, we don't know much about it. The traditional view is that the Samaritans were the product of the Jews that were either left in Palestine when Assyria exiled the 10 tribes in the north in the 700s. The story says there were some problems, and so the king of Assyria had some of them brought back so they could calm the situation down. This is as I said, the common usual view explaining the Samaritans. So they're, quote, half-breeds. They're these Jews that were left over or brought back, and the people then who were moved in to replace them. Because what the Syrians did in their conquest was to deport most of the people and bring a whole bunch of people they conquered somewhere else in. So now you had two groups of people living in places they'd never lived before. It cuts way down on their ability to create problems. The reality, of course, is they didn't move everybody. They didn't worry about moving everybody. Most of the common people, they weren't concerned about anyway. It was the aristocracy, landowners, people who had money, officials, the court, that kind of stuff. So there was a whole lot of their people left. But they brought some other people in, so you had this mixing. And many people then see these as the opponents of Ezra and Nehemiah when they come back from the captivity and rebuild. Sanballat and the group that doesn't want the walls rebuilt and that whole issue. And so there's this opposition is seen there. Historically, there's almost no evidence of that. So the scholars who work on the Samaritans don't adhere to that theory at all. They believe the Samaritans can't possibly have existed till much later. And their chief evidence for it, of course, is that the Samaritans had Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua as their Bible. They had basically the Torah. And of course, for most academics, the Torah isn't even invented until Ezra and Nehemiah come back from captivity. And either it was done in captivity or it was done shortly after they got back, that this material is finally edited and produced in any meaningful way. Well, of course, if it was done then people who didn't like them and were opposed to them certainly wouldn't have accepted that as a meaningful document. And so that traditional view is not really upheld in the academic world at all. And there's significant evidence in a variety of other places that indicate the Samaritans don't come on the scene as a distinctive group until later. And they certainly don't become in great tension with the Jews until that set of rulers, often called the Hasmoneans or the Maccabeans, the freedom fighters of Israel who liberate the country from the Syrian Greeks in that 170 years or so before Jesus. And they create some real problems with their neighbors. They have a forced conversion of many of the people in Galilee. That's why the Galileans weren't particularly looked upon with favor by the Judeans, because they were latecomers. One of those Hasmoneans actually tears down the temple that the Samaritans have. So there's real bad blood by Jesus' day. But that's recent. And even that's significantly different from what we ordinarily say and think, because you see, we have this vision that in the New Testament there's this real bad blood between the Samaritans and the Jews. And yet, in the very early church, there is very striking evidence that Stephen, one of those first guys selected, was a Samaritan. You read his sermon in Acts 7, you compare it, his quotes from the Torah, and they don't match. Because your Torah is taken from the Jewish Pentateuch, and Stephen's quotes come from the Samaritan Pentateuch. And his quotes aren't found in any other source except the Samaritan Pentateuch. Well, how's this guy, where there's this horrible, terrible, bad blood between these peoples, how has this guy already risen to a place of leadership in the Jerusalem church? So maybe even our understanding of that is flawed a little bit. Anyway, the Samaritan Pentateuch is a copy of those first 5 books plus Joshua in the Old Testament, and in many cases, it has these peculiarity differences with the traditional Jewish reading in the Hebrew text. The LXX, which is Latin numbers for 70, is a conventional code used to talk about the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was in existence by Jesus' day. But saying that is a fiction. Now remember, first century, they didn't have books. The Jews used scrolls. So there was no book of a Greek translation of the Hebrew text. There were scrolls of various books of the Old Testament written in Greek, translated from the Hebrew. They start by and probably well before 300 years before Jesus. There is no evidence that there was ever a group who did the whole Old Testament. The copies that we have a great deal of variety in them. So there is no, quote, Greek translation of the Old Testament. Now, we know about it as a, quote, Greek translation because in these 4th and 5th century manuscripts that we now have of pretty much the whole Bible, There's three of them. They have the Old Testament and the New Testament. And they have books in the Old Testament translated into Greek. And so we have these three manuscripts. They have the same kind of differences that we have in the New Testament books. But in addition to those, we know of a whole much more. Great many of the Dead Sea Scrolls are Bible texts, and many of them are in Greek. And we know when we compare those Greek translations to the copies, these three manuscripts, they're different. But it's still a convention that we can talk about, quote, the Septuagint, which is fancy 70. The Vulgate, of course, is the Latin translation. And the Vulgate, again, is almost a fiction. Now, it's a real translation because in the 5th century, Jerome is commissioned by the bishop in Rome to make a translation of the Bible into Latin because there's so many translations around and they're different. They're like the 47 English translations you guys have now today. And the bishop wanted one translation that he could insist everybody ought to read and ignore the others. So he had Jerome translate. So Jerome did. Now, Jerome crossed him up because Jerome didn't go to the Greek Bible, which they had done before. All those Latin translations were from the Greek. Jerome went back to the Hebrew Bible. And so he creates this problem. These three great manuscripts have some of those books you were mentioning a while ago. Well, the Hebrews, the Jews, didn't have any of those. And so when Jerome did his Vulgate initially, he didn't translate any of those either because they weren't in the Greek manuscript. I mean, in the Hebrew manuscripts. And he was forced to eventually include them. But the Bible was very, very early translated by people into Latin because the western end of the Mediterranean, that includes North Africa. Remember, in Jesus' day, all of the Eastern Mediterranean was ruled by the Greeks. Cleopatra was not an Egyptian. She was a Greek. West of Egypt, everything across North Africa was all ruled by the Romans. It was Latin. So all of North Africa, except Egypt on the eastern end, and all of the Western Mediterranean was Latin speaking. Well, the gospel gets there very early. Paul writes a book to the Romans. And so almost, the New Testament books are hardly being copied until they're being translated. Because there are all these readers who don't know Greek. And so we've got any number of these floating around, pieces of them to compare. And then the Syriac is the language to the east. And it's really nothing but the Aramaic with a different script. And thus it's very close to Hebrew. And again, in Jesus' day, remember, there were actually more Jews that lived in Babylon, Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, than lived in Palestine. And the Bible was already being spoken and probably even written in Aramaic, not Hebrew. So as the Jewish faith developed in the East, particularly after the destruction of Jerusalem, and Mesopotamia becomes the center of Jewish learning. So the Babylonian Talmud far is greater than the Palestinian Talmud. They developed the tradition, since most of these Jews didn't speak Hebrew, they spoke Aramaic. The languages are close, but they have different grammar, a little bit different vocabulary. And so, you know, you could kind of fumble your way through and figure out a little bit about what was going on. But the Jews developed the tradition in Mesopotamia of reading scripture in the synagogue in Hebrew, reading the text, the scroll. And then someone would translate it into Aramaic so the people could understand. That tradition became so fixed that even after those Jewish communities lost Aramaic, because they adopted different vernacular depending on where they lived, they still read it in Hebrew, translated it verbally into Aramaic, and then had to translate it again into Yiddish or whatever the culture of the people were that would be able to understand it.
The book of Daer is a testament to that.
Yeah.
It's written.
It's split, and you have that, you see already happening when they come back. When the scripture is read in Ezra and Nehemiah, it's read and translated. That's what Ezra and people with him are doing. So it was already being done. So you have these, you have these two versions, the Jewish version and the Samaritan version of the Pentateuch. And then you have this Greek version in many varieties, and these Latin versions in many varieties, very early. And we have manuscripts of that. We have, in most cases, it's only pieces, pages of a book or something. But at various places in the Bible, we now can see an alternative reading to what the Hebrew text has. And we now know that you can't say, if the Greek said it this way, then that's a lousy translation. Because now we have found a Hebrew manuscript, the Samaritan manuscript, where it's in Hebrew exactly like the Greek translated it. It wasn't that he was a lousy translator, he was using a different copy of Hebrew. Then the Jews ended up making their, quote, authoritative copy. And so you get these comparisons. And here in the very beginning of the book of Genesis, you get one of those fascinating little places. The Masoretic, the Hebrew text, reads, Cain said to Abel his brother, and then doesn't say what he said. But all these other versions have a sentence, let's go out into the field. Now the question is, did the Greeks stick that in just so it made sense? Well, that's a little hard because the Samaritan Pentateuch in Hebrew has it too. So it's much more logical that somehow this got dropped in the manuscripts that the Hebrews, the Jews, used through the centuries copying their manuscripts. Now, if you go to the end of this thing, page 2, I give you some examples. There are 4 of them here. Hebrew manuscript tradition of alternatives. It turns out that there are several places in the Hebrew manuscripts, and until we found this Isaiah manuscript and some other lesser ones in a synagogue, got locked up, closed up in a closet, nobody remembered it was there, in Cairo before that, we didn't have any Hebrew manuscripts older than 1000 AD. Because the Hebrews thought this was sacred material, and so when it got worn out and they couldn't use it, they destroyed it, burned it, buried it. So it just wasn't around. But At various places in their manuscripts, they note, this is what the text has written. But that's not what we read. Our verbal tradition has a different reading than is written. We won't touch the text, but we don't think that's original. And so it wouldn't surprise us, you see, that once this passage in Genesis 4 got dropped, and there got to be some Hebrew manuscripts around without it, that they made no attempt to correct it. They just didn't correct manuscripts. They were sacred. And once the tradition post-Jesus came into existence, they had a very rigid procedure for verifying their copies. It was very elaborate. They would count the letters in the book and see which letter was the middle one. And they'd count the letters in the copy they made. And if that wasn't the same letter in the same sentence in the same line, then there was an error somewhere. And they go back and find it and do a whole new manuscript. But they knew even as they're copying. And they had another one, not just this is not the way we read it, but they had another one where they actually note this was a change. The word that was originally was a vulgar word or a word we don't remember anymore, and so we changed it to this word. So they know, they knew. But that means the text is going to stay pretty well the way it is. Another very interesting one, and this comes to light because of Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the story of Samuel, after Samuel was weaned, his mother took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull. That's what the NIV reads. And then they tell you, this is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Greek Septuagint, and the Syriac. The Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, says she took 3 bulls, not a 3-year-old bull. And then I gave you a couple of these that in Isaiah, where now we have this whole complete manuscript. And so we can make some real comparisons. And sure enough, we find out that there's several places in the Hebrew text that we always thought were funny, maybe even wrong. And sure enough, it's different, it's sensible in the Isaiah scroll in Qumran. So that's an indication that somewhere along the line, the Hebrew text got corrupted a little bit, and because they were faithful to it, they kept it, even though they knew that can't be what it means. And here now is the evidence. But again, we're talking about things like this is a city of destruction or a city of the sun. You're not going to change any major doctrine. You're not going to change any doctrine, even minor. You're not going to change any major historical event or its story if you go through every single one of these differences. What you have is a perfectly workable copy and a perfectly workable translation that has the complete story, as the complete Bible, you don't need to worry about it. It won't make any difference which translation you use. It won't make any difference which manuscript you chose if you got to be that good of a scholar. It's not going to make that much difference. On the other hand, since there are these differences, then you can't trust any translation or any specific manuscript on a specific verse, because this may be the verse it got wrong. It may be the verse that it copied the wrong thing. And so, read, study. If you start nitpicking on a verse and you start pressing the manuscript, then you need to be careful. Because on this verse, this may not be the best, the most reliable, or the most understandable or sensible. And there's no easy way to know that. That's the reason I introduced you to these footnotes, and you need to learn how to read those footnotes in your Bible, how they describe this material. And unfortunately, you'll find I haven't found one yet that was consistent. They will not use consistent language to describe the sources or the importance of those sources. And there again, while you know them, and you need to know them, you really, if you're gonna press them in any way at all, then you need to have a broader reading. You need to get some commentaries that discuss the textual issue. You need to get some commentaries that talk not only about the text, but the implications of the differences of the text. So you really can weigh what's going on. And when you do that, of course, you'll find out there's a difference of opinion. But there's, contrary to a popular opinion among a widespread group of Christians, you can't make a stand, carte blanche, on any source. So those who want to argue that the manuscripts behind the King James are by far the best, always on every verse, and the King James is the best translation of those texts, always on every verse, are simply dreaming. You can't do that on any translation.
That could be a matter of opinion.
It's always a struggle. How do I weigh this evidence? It's this way in these manuscripts, it's this way in these manuscripts. How do I decide which of these two, or three, or four, or five differences is more likely the original? And that's not easy to do. Which tells us something about the nature of the way God gave us the Bible. He apparently didn't think that was an important issue. For us to have one indisputable text for all the Bible. He didn't make any attempt to do that. He left it in human hands, even as he wrote it with human hands.
And I don't know, I think about it like that for different people. To me, the way that I worship, the way that I show my respect to God, that's my way. But somebody else, take somebody from Africa or somebody that's out there in the desert underneath a tree, and they raise their hands and pray, that's the way they pray over it. And they're completely in tune with their God. They're in tune with the Lord.
With the God.
With the God.
There are obviously some overarching principles in the Bible, in the New Testament, that we need to be aware of. But the reality is that the vast majority of what we do as Christians is subject to the principles that God gives us and rarely ever specify the issue of worship. See, I would even quibble with you the fact that God is fairly specific about worship in the New Testament, far more than we think, but he's talking about something entirely different than we call worship. And the reason he doesn't talk much about what we call worship is exactly the point you make. And the point I make frequently about a lot of the Christian life, in many respects, a fundamental difference between Judaism and Christianity is that Judaism was for a particular people, for a particular place, for a particular time. And the gospel was intended to be universal geographically and historically. And therefore, he didn't try to say, 3 times a year, I want you to come to this place, because he knew there were going to be followers of Jesus in places who could never get there in their entire lifetime. Because there were what? 1,400 years of them before they went very far. They didn't have the means to get there. And everything's that way. I'm convinced that's one of the reasons why, and the next issue that we're going to look at is the matter of geography, why there are not hardly any places in the Bible that you can absolutely for sure say this is it. You can't point to Mount Sinai and say this is where God gave the law. You can't do that. And I believe the reason is God didn't want you to be able to do that. And I even have a story for that in the Bible. Remember after Mount Carmel, Elijah runs away and he goes, the story says, to Horeb. Where is Horeb? Horeb is the book of Deuteronomy's name for Sinai. Elijah is going back to the mountain. And when he gets there, what happens? There's an earthquake, a fire, and a wind. And God's not in them. Like he was in Moses' day at the same place. He's in us. There's no place you need to go. You don't need to know where Jesus was baptized so you can be baptized there. You don't need to know where the tomb was so you can look into the empty tomb. You don't need any of that. Because the time is coming when you won't worship me in Jerusalem or on that mountain. You'll worship me everywhere, all the time. And everything will become your liturgy of worship.
happening. It's happening.
Okay, any question about the textual issues and your possibility of running into them occasionally? Just take some time when you're reading your Bible and you notice a footnote, you notice a marginal note about the translation, the manuscript, take a look at it. And long enough to begin to figure out what they're doing, what they're trying to tell you. And remember that net Bible that's on the internet, keep that as a favorite so you can bring it up, because they're likely to have a discussion about it if you can't find it anywhere else immediately. I haven't found one yet that they don't discuss. And they often quote that one book I told you, that textual commentary of the New Testament. They quote that guy all the time. So you don't even have to have the book. You can just find it. Okay, if there's no further questions about that, there aren't but two other major issues in terms of studying the Bible in an overarching way that you need to be familiar with some of the things that are involved in that. We've looked at the Bible text and the words and how to find all that stuff and the commentaries and all that issue. We've seen how to find not just the words, but the topics. And we've seen the text in terms of the parallels when they occur. The other two issues are, of course, well, I suppose you could say three, the places that they are, and the people who are there, and then what their history is. There's a whole lot of information about the places, and that, of course, is helpful in terms of understanding relationships of events and the people and some of the chronology of the time. So one of the sources that you need to have in your library or on your regular favorites on your are the atlases. And let's see, here we go. Here's, I'll send you this. Here are some of the sites that have online atlases on them. Let me see, I had a note that I wanted to make on one of these, and I'll mark it when I send it to you. This one on the online Bible atlases, a complete set of maps. This is basically a link, a bunch of links that takes you to some places. And they have a couple of old sets of Bible, of maps that they will download for you, and you can blow them up and all that kind of stuff on your computer. You can't get the overlays easily. Google Maps, of course, will show you the modern situation, and you can, by especially the satellite view, you can get some ideas of terrain and that kind of thing, which is helpful. But remember, things have changed in 2,000 years. Even the terrain has changed some. Sea of Galilee hasn't moved. Dead Sea hasn't moved. But in terms of specific sites, they've changed. Most all the current cities are on top of cities through the 2,000 years since Jesus' day. So you're not going to get to walk on very many of the streets that Jesus walked on. They're 30 or 40 feet below you. But some of these, and you can just Google these and find one or two that is really helpful to you, and put it on your. I'll send you a bibliography, and now example variants. Now it's not going to show up for me. So let me kill this and see why not. Stop sharing. And let's see if I can go back to the share again. Nope. I can close this and then maybe try again. Well, it's not showing my screen behind this. Nope. Let's get these out of the way. Get this one out of the way. Get this one out of the way. Oh, no wonder it closed on me, folks. Sorry about that. Okay, let me see if I can bring this up. Here we go. Here's a pretty extensive bibliography that I'll send you. There are both the atlases themselves, the actual maps of the Bible, and they're more than one. They'll give you one that has topography and one that shows vegetation maybe, and then you'll have several where they'll locate the various historical situations. And you need to have a good one. Now, your Bible may have a pretty good one in it, but it would be better if you had a pretty good one. You may find one of these online that will work for you anytime, and then you won't have to spend the money on a used bookstore of getting something. But you also have these historical geographies where they don't show you just the maps, but they take you through the history of the Bible and the sites that are there, how the sites change name from Old Testament to New Testament, or even within the Old Testament, and how those sites appear in the Old Testament story. So there's two sets of books there. And then, of course, in addition to the actual atlases, you got the whole wealth of the archaeology, which of course deals with those sites. Now, it's interpreted biblical text historically and all those kinds of things, but archaeology is the digging around in the places. So archaeology fits well with any kind of work of atlas. And one of those historical atlases may work very well because they rely on a lot of archaeology. And so you could get by with one of them. And this is the kind of thing, take a copy of this one time when you can go to one of the major libraries and where you can look through 2 or 3 of these. And don't spend any amount of money on any one of these until you've had a chance to look at several. And so you don't spend $39 and next day see one for $29. It's better than the one you got. And 2 or 3 of these atlases, we're not talking about $29. We're talking about $129 because they're pretty technical pieces of writing and drawing. So it's worth looking through. And then, of course, I added to this one the history and the geography because when you're looking at the sites, you're going to be dealing with their history. And we have that both for the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's why this list of books is so much longer than usually. Here's one of the larger size atlases, and here's one of the older historical atlases. This one was done by the Wycliffe Moody Press several years ago. It's not current, and it's not the usually considered the better one of that. I have a Harones, but I couldn't find it to bring in here to show you.
So you would recommend the one to your right?
One like this. There are a couple that are even rated better than this one. And you might, very realistically, a major Bible atlas is going to set you back some money. So as I said, it's worth having a chance to be somewhere where you could look at 2 or 3 of them and see, and your chances for that are going to be best at a bigger library. Not very many bookstores would carry more than 1 or 2. They would order, of course, any one you wanted, but you don't really know which one you want. Remember that a significant number of Bible sites are by the scholars still debated. We've done excavations at a site that we've pretty well created a consensus that this is old Gezer or whatever, but you're still going to find an outlier, an archaeologist who says, no, I don't think so. We haven't found the gate that has the name on it yet. And therefore, tradition, the folk tales of the people who live there, it's pretty solid, but it's not absolute. And you're aware of the fact that that's one of the whole discussions about the destruction of the destruction of Ai, where they get defeated at first. Most Bible archaeologists and historians accept the view that Ai was destroyed long before 12 or 1400, when Joshua supposedly entered the land. Because according to their studies of this site, in 1400, it was already kaput. It had been buried, had been rebuilt for a couple hundred years. So the story is phony. They made the story up, or however they want to describe it. Well, that's based strictly on your chronology, and you're identifying this site. And until you find something in this site that's got the name on it, don't tell me that the story is totally phony simply because your chronology and your understanding of this site don't match the Bible story. I got failed in graduate school by a professor for writing about the Philistines, because in my day in graduate school, it was still sure doctrine that the Philistines didn't get to Palestine until way into the time of Saul, into the time of the Judges. And yet in the Bible story, they're there in Abraham's day. Well, now it turns out that there's been some scholars of the Philistines who don't accept the traditional scholarly chronology or origin. We had all this worked out, you see. And now there are some people saying, well, I don't know about that. They may have been there sooner than we thought they were. now there's not, I'm not aware that there are very many serious archaeologists, scholars of history, Palestinian history, who really believe that the Jews came in any significant number at the same time. The whole entrance story, and of course the Exodus story that precedes it, but they just have not found the archaeological evidence that indicates the kind of cultural change that should have happened when the story of Joshua, or the study of Judges, is told, of Joshua and Judges. The archaeology evidence just isn't there. Well, maybe it's our evidence that we're looking at wrong. There's a famous outlier of archaeology who has insisted for 50 years that our traditional scholarly chronology of the ancient Near East is 500 years off. Our Egyptian chronologies, our Assyrian chronologies are all 500 years off. Well, 500 years is a lot of time. And for you to say, well, everything was gone when Joshua got there that the Bible says was there, it all got destroyed 500 years before he got there. Well, maybe you just got the chronology wrong. Maybe what you're seeing, the destruction 500 years before Joshua, was Joshua. You need to go back and look. There's a lot we know, but there is a whole lot we don't know. A whole lot we don't know. Okay, I'll send you all this material. Obviously, your Bible dictionaries and Bible encyclopedias will give you a great deal of discussion about places. They all have maps in them. Do what you can to look at some atlases, familiarize your one with the one you have in your Bible, any one that you might have in another book at home. Bug your preacher about which one he uses, and take a look at it if he'll let you. Borrow it if he'll let you. Sit in his office and look at it for a little bit if he'll let you. So you can see about maybe getting one for yourself that has a little bit more than what you'll just find in your Bible map. I mean, in your maps in your Bible. And how the geography, of course, fits into the story is often pretty significant. Okay.
I just saw a new documentary on the archaeologists and genealogists. Archaeologists, we did it on Jericho.
Mm-hmm.
On Joshua. Yeah.
And those are here anytime you want to use it for something specific. Yeah, I have the whole set.
Okay.
So any book that you want to use one on, when you're actually going to do something, it's here to call me up and make a way to come borrow it for a little while or copy pages out of it.
I appreciate that. I'll take a picture of this one. The whole set.
I have the whole set. I have the whole set.
We got a group for about 7 or 8 years. We just kind of took a year break. We thinking, my wife and I.
Mm-hmm.
And,
And I've got a fairly complete variety of commentaries on all the New Testament. And I've got several sets on the Old Testament and then a number of other books. And they're all available anytime they would be of any value to you. Oh,
Can I borrow this one?
yeah, you may look at it.
Yeah, I like what I saw in what you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think that in terms of one book, one Bible to have to carry, you just can't find anything that compares with that. The reality, of course, is that it doesn't have the historical notes and things like that that a study Bible would have, but then it doesn't get you into the doctrinal discussions and all that kind of stuff that a Bible study, most Bible studies would do with you at one place or another. It just has a whole lot of the text. There's a pretty good section of archaeology in the back of it, major sites. But the real jewel is its topical index, where there just isn't, nothing compares to that except Nave's Topical Bible, for instance. And that means you have to carry a whole nother book. This has the same kind of thing all in with your Bible.
We can
Yeah.
project.
And you can get versions of that now that aren't too expensive. It's still not a cheap Bible, but unless you have a Monser's Topical Bible or Nave's Topical Bible and a really good Bible dictionary, I just can't find anything better for that than that one is for you to have with you all the time. I don't carry it now near as much as I used to. I've worn out a couple of them. When I did far more aggressive home Bible study and evangelism, I wouldn't carry it because I wanted the people to use their Bible. And we'd look at their Bible, mark up their Bible so they could see it when I was gone. But when I used to travel weekends and preach, that was my library. I never went anywhere I didn't have my Thompson Jane. Had a fairly good concordance for major verses and their words. Between the topical index and the concordance, I could almost always find any verse I was wanting to find. And no telling how many sermons I built from the topical index. And back in the days when I could read the print that small, even on the Bible, on the pulpit, you could start at the front with the first verse that was in that topic. And you didn't have to go to the back. You just go from, it'd tell you which verse to go to next. And you could just go right straight through the Bible and 5 or 6 or 7 verses on this topic and read them and then talk about them to whatever degree, relate them to each other, show their differences, their different slant, color, the conflict between them maybe. And I could do it all from the Thompson chain. It just, until you get to a study Bible, the modern study Bibles that have pretty prolific notes that help explain history and culture and words and that kind of thing. There just wasn't anything that compared to Thompson Chain. I'll let you go, Cheryl.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I think I'll leave this one. Next week, I'm gonna start shopping for one. So your preference would be? something
That's
like that?
that's a really, really good
So
one.
maybe there's another
And I don't think
one.
it's quite as expensive as the the most highly regarded one. But I've got an older version of,
Would you recommend the Barnes and Nobles for things like this?
Barnes and Nobles might have some, but I doubt they would have very many versions, very many different editions. They might carry one or the other of something. And certainly if it was really usable to you, it looked fine, it wasn't super expensive, I would, because again, it's, you know, when you get the bibliography and you see he lists like 3 or 4 of them, all pretty highly recommended. And it's not like you're going to go wrong if you used any one of those. It's just a matter of what felt most comfortable to you to use, what you've found most usable, and what it was going to cost you. And unfortunately, we don't have half-price books anymore for you to go by their place to see if they might happen to have one. Half-price books, I understand that they've closed. It's possible they haven't closed yet. So if you're close to one or run by one, to and fro and regularly, you might stop and see. Because I've been in them and seen some of those things like that. Especially now in the days of the internet, you see, and all these Bible study programs that you can now put on your computer. There are a whole lot of those things that are around because preachers who had them have retired, died, and now there's no market for them. So they're really cheap. And there's no school library who wants them because they hardly even need them now because they want the guys to have the Bible study program on their computer. They may even give it to them as a part of their tuition fee or something.
What's something like this cost?
I've forgotten. That may have been $40 or $50.
Do they, are these in editions where they make them, where they have more information? Latest edition?
There's probably an updated version of that because I've had that one probably 20 years.
20 years?
Let me see what the
You've
date
had
on
it
it
20
is.
years and look what it has in there. It has the Catif amulets.
Uh-huh. Let's see what the date on it was. 2006.
It's not that old.
14, 15 years. So they may not have produced a new version of it yet.
Leave that page where the Catif is. I've been doing some research on this,
Yeah.
with this amulet. Can I borrow this?
Yeah.
Thank you. This is the only one that I have. I gave you the other books back.
Okay.